Pandemonium broke out in Kenya's capital, Nairobi, this afternoon as protesters stormed a section of parliament. This follows the House's approval of a contentious finance bill. Several people are feared dead and over 50 have been injured during the tax protests. Kenyan police tried to push out protesters who gained entry into the parliamentary complex. Now, the protesters are angry about proposed new tax increases that the government wants to implement in a bid to resolve its budgetary deficit. All right, let's now bring in a writer and commentator on African affairs, Joseph Ochieno, to just weigh in on the developments in Kenya on the protests against the proposed financial bill. Thank you so much for your time. Of course, we are seeing these developments in Kenya. I mean, what can you tell us about the latest rounds of protests? What we do know, of course, so far is that the protesters have burnt administrative buildings in the capital, just given this ongoing multi-billion rand tax hike proposal, that is.
It's extraordinary. It's a fast-moving event. I can't give you any specific latest from Kampala, and I can tell you there are not many people in Nairobi who would be able to do so. I've been on phone with a few colleagues, but it's not quite clearly possible. Fast-moving, but it's an extraordinarily unfortunate event. Tragic, isn't it? This reminds some of us of the Marikana massacre, and of course, particularly those of us who were young kids, the Sharpeville massacre. To reach this stage and the manner in which the Kenyan youth had warned again and come out in droves and very peaceful, as it were, for live fire, live bullets to return as an alternative to this is extremely unfortunate. But that said again, politically, I don't know what President Ruto was thinking to allow this process to continue, in spite of the majority of the Kenyan citizens simply saying no to this, just because they know or they felt that they had the numbers in the National Assembly. And again, I'm not sure what the Kenyan legislators were thinking about. I've been in Kenya and I've been covering some of these things in the last few months, including last year. Kenya faced one of the biggest cost of living protests on the African continent.
Mr.
And so
Ochieno,
that the politicians would not listen. Yes.
I want us to give context. So, as we go into the areas of contention, the understanding, of course, is that Parliament has approved this controversial finance bill, moving it then through to a third reading by lawmakers. The next step is for the legislation to be then sent to the president for signing. That's President Ruto. Perhaps just unpack the areas of contention here that you know of.
I think the entirety of the bill is contentious. The Kenyans have been protesting over a period of time. One, in terms of the tax levies, very unreasonable, whether it's about basic foodstuffs or to fuel, whether or not it's about the expense, as Kenyans see that in relative to really what the tax deficits were, where most of the money is going to and or coming from. The politics in the country has been contentious, has been rather sad in the last couple of years. I am simply saying that actually the timing could not have been worse for the Kenyan government, regardless of the details, meaning the authorities on both sides, really, the political divide in Parliament, would know that once particularly young people came in the street to simply say no. We sensed a little bit of this in Kampala just a few weeks ago, but of course that did not really go very far. The focus really is that the majority of the guys on the streets are saying that, look, they are being targeted, they're the lowest of the low, and the guys at the top are the most privileged, and they're really not listening to them, despite of the fact that many of them would have people who have been democratically elected, as it were, which elections, of course, as you know, were contentious.
And I mean, just reading some of the reports that are coming in, that police, as you said, have fired live rounds, along with rubber bullets and tear gas, cracked down on these protests. Of course, some reports saying that bodies are lying on the streets, and these, of course, are youth-led rallies. So it is concerning. I mean, what at this moment should President William Ruto then be saying to these protesters, of course, as we try to understand just the impact of this particular protest? We, of course, understand that over 50 people are injured so far.
Yeah. Yes, many deaths, and actually the numbers are not, if you look through social media, some of these are unconfirmed, but actually very traumatic. I think the president, this would be the time for him basically to to call for a national calm and to ask for a review and to have a national conversation across the political divide, particularly just like the young Kenyans were saying that, look, this is not about parties anymore, it's not about religion anymore, nor is it about tribes, ethnicity, identity questions. It's very much about us Kenyans. As I said, if you look at the manner in which politics has been polarized in more recent times, would be extremely insensitive for the president. Indeed, I would be very surprised if he were to assent to the legislation in any way. But I think the signs were all over that these guys were not going to stop the young guys. But particularly as of to yesterday, actually, the protests were peaceful. And as I said, how authorities in Kenya could choose to fire live bullets, I genuinely do not know. I'm just returning from Europe where protests do take place as a matter of formality. I'm not quite sure whether anybody releasing live firearms on a protesters in a country which is relatively, in quote, democratic like Kenya, or indeed South Africa, would be anything which is actually acceptable in this day and age.
And I mean, as you say, of course, this is a country that is already reeling from a cost of living crisis. Now people are calling for President Ruto to step down. I mean, what does this all mean for him particularly, just given the fact that, he won his election at the back of saying that he would fight particularly for the poor people of Kenya?
That's interesting, isn't it? Actually, he picked this slogan, the hustler, from an early campaign by Raila Odinga, his opponent, and managed to actually channel it in such a manner that he presented himself as the poor people's guy from from Kenya Highlands. And so basically, actually it worked for him because many young people, notwithstanding the contention of the results, a number of young people actually rallied around him, thinking that he was basically part of them, but he clearly wasn't. In any case, actually, what happens now, I think it is very difficult. I don't see him preparing for himself to go for a second term in Kenya with the contentions. I also know that he's been having issues with these deputy president, as they call it in Kenya. Actually, in South Africa, we also call them deputy president, vice president of Kenya. They already have their own internal challenges. But at the moment, really, the perception generally is very much about politics with them versus us. So it's less about Ruto alone and this party alone, but more about the Kenyan elites. Some of the stories that you hear, including here in Uganda, where legislators live big and public services are nil. In Kenya, by and large, in public service terms, you couldn't compare it to some other African countries, including my native Uganda. But the perception really that a privileged few hundred people could give themselves a huge amount of monies, and then when monies are not coming from the usual suspects, IMF and World Bank and these days Chinese, you simply say that, well, we're going to review the figures and tax the ordinary citizens. I think it's absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, and one would then be interested to see how the international community, of course, responds to that. But Mr. Ochieno, that's all the time we have this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time.